Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Playing with Power podcast, the podcast where we talk about all things CEDH, EDH, and Magic the Gathering. I'm your host, Ryan.
And I am your host, TK, and today we are going to be talking about window theory, or better yet, how to seize your opportunity to win in EDH. But first, we are going to talk about our sponsors.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Card Conduit. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I've used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value of my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best buy list price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half of the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their new sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would have from a major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list price against the specific condition of a card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the show notes or the description, or use the promo code POWER, you'll also get 10% off their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's podcast.
So today's topic, we are going to be talking about a little bit of deck theory or game theory, if you want to call that. Shout out to Matt Pat. We're going to talk about specifically how to...
Rest in peace, Matt Pat. Rest in peace.
We're going to be talking about how to seize your wins. What does that mean for EDH? This is something that's kind of been going on, or as far as a school of thought, for the majority of Magic. It's something that people talk about a lot in 60 card, but we don't really talk about it as it relates to Commander. So that's kind of the deal of what we're discussing here today. And before we get into it, I do want to give a quick shout out to Rebell Son on all social media. I believe they are the ones who kind of started this talk about how window theory relates to Commander a while ago on their channel. So we'll probably link it somewhere around, but definitely go support Rebel. One of my favorite content creators for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely agreed.
So yeah, Ryan, you got anything you want to say before we get started on this class session here?
I love pontificating about this format. I love talking about ways to improve. I love talking about ways to get better. And window theory is actually something that is a little bit, I guess the best way I could put it is that it's a little bit foreign to me. Not in the idea, but maybe how it's encapsulated into this actual school of thought that was being talked about so much on social media. I was reading about it and I thought it was so interesting. And I'm actually really excited to talk about it today. Not only to give everyone out there who's listening to this a little bit more education into it, but also myself, quite frankly. I'd love to be a passenger in these types of talks because it helps me become better. It helps me become a better player. It helps me it helps make our content better. I just think it's wonderful that we get to talk about this kind of stuff, and hopefully all of you out there also get to get something out of it too.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I think talking about theory specifically in this game that's been going on for more than 30 years is so interesting because it's seldom talked about, I think, in a lot of spaces, but it's recognized in a lot of spaces as well. Like a lot of players who probably when we get into this topic are going to realize that they know something about this, but just haven't dug deep in it. You know what I mean? And I think that's going to be really cool to see that idea be kind of fleshed out in a more proper way.
Not to mention actually putting a terminology onto it.
Yeah.
Actually all putting all these thoughts into an actual terminology that you can then take forward into those spaces which you discuss this type of stuff, whether it be social media or in private chats or discords or just among your friends. Actually having terminology goes so much farther than I think people think it does when you can actually put a name to the thoughts that are, bouncing around your head, for lack of a better word.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's always better to have like actual definitions for things rather than stumbling upon like, the thing.
It's on the tip of my tongue. It's where the thing happens with the thing, Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Way better.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess we should get started, huh?
Yep. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to ask you the first question. So what is window theory?
Yeah, 100%. So window theory, as I would like to define it, is the school of thought in Magic specifically. But I guess you could put it to most card games, but specifically when we're talking about Magic, it's the school of thought that attributes every deck archetype to having a specified point in the game where they're more likely to win than any other point. So if you're talking about deck archetypes, 60 card has these almost, I want to say, like a triangle. If you think of like Pokemon types or, like rock, paper, scissors, 60 card archetypes have these sort of archetype. There's these schools that we put these decks in, and you've heard of them before: aggro, control, midrange. And generally speaking, this is not the case all the time, but generally speaking, they play like rock, paper, scissors in the advantages that they have over one another. So aggro is more likely to beat control because it can beat them on the play and kind of overwhelm them with a lot of card advantage early on with their cheap to play creatures and things like that. While control can kind of outlast midrange because their cards are better suited for the later game. And then midrange is able to outlast aggro, obviously because it's able to kind of deal with their early threats and then move on to the area of the game that aggro really can't do. And so this kind of triangle that we have specifies to window theory specifically because in that we know which, like when we're talking about when we're talking about the specific decks, sorry, they are talking about specifically how much time they have to win. Aggro wants to win as soon as possible. They don't have the resources to go into the late game, usually speaking, in order to win by, past turn 6 or 7. Like they want to win fast. Control does have it, but doesn't usually have the resources to win fast. Whereas midrange does have the tools to go longer and go the distance when compared to aggro, but it can't really match when it comes to control. And so this rock, paper, scissors is something that you see all the time in 60 card. Anybody who's been playing on a pro level can tell you that, often. And it's something that you see a lot. But when it comes to Commander, we don't really talk about that because the terminology is different. You don't really, especially in CEDH, you're not really talking about aggro or control, or midrange is there, but it's a lot different because we're using things like turbo and stacks. And people are probably wondering, okay, well, what is that when we're comparing to 60 card? Well, how does this relate to CEDH or EDH for that matter? And the answer is that if you really look in those archetypes, we get all of our things from 60 card Magic. Magic was developed to be played like 60 card. And so a lot of these archetypes that we're seeing in Commander are really forefathered by the 60 card archetypes. So Turbo is kind of the counterpart to aggro. It utilizes cheap cards, fast rituals, trying to outpace the other decks at the table, while Stacks decks can be seen as a counterpart to Control, wanting to keep decks at bay and really go the distance, where their resources are going to be a lot more valuable than the decks that had to burn all of those resources to get there before. Midrange is the only one that kind of stays the same, just because, and a lot of people, I think, are figuring that out now with where the current CDH meta is, that midrange just kind of means a good pile of cards. And I hate to say that because a lot of people are like, oh, well, is turbo bad or is control bad? That's not what I mean. But midrange by design is this idea that you're trying to put card quality over everything. So you want cards that are going to be able to do things immediately, but also not be wasteful in that sense. And so Midrange is the one that kind of has a one-to-one translation where you're really just trying to be varied and have answers to whatever comes up. And so window theory is specifically taking these three archetypes and seeing where in the game of Magic, or in this case, a game of Commander, do these decks want to play?
That's so cool. So I've heard of, the three different archetypes and then the pyramids and 60 card and stuff like that. And I always have known that CEDH doesn't really have an aggro because Commander didn't really have an aggro. And to see it kind of come over to a turbo, I have heard that translation before. I know that in that rock, paper, scissors thing, I know that in the past I have seen instances where that kind of stuff has happened. When Flash was legal, everything kind of revolved around Flash, and people called it Flash Winter and stuff like that. And what happened is that Flash was banned, and it left this massive chasm where kind of the turboist of the turbo decks, even though, it could be construed as mid-range and all this other stuff, left this huge gap. Just it wasn't there because Flash was more predominant than what we consider Grixis Turbo to be today. And that was kind of the turbo or the aggro part of it. And without Flash there was just nothing there. So we got caught in this like crazy mid-range flood that just overtook because there was no aggro, because Flash pushed out all other aggro. You either were Flash or you were one of the other two archetypes. And when Flash was banned, all of a sudden, all the turbo was gone. And so what happened was all of the mid-range suddenly flooded all of the metas, basically the medium greens of the world with a Tymna Thrasis, where you just get unbelievable value with things like Seedborn Muse and stuff like that. And you just grind mid-range uncontrollably. Whereas in Europe, what happened was that they had a heavy turbo meta. A lot of Grixis Turbo was going on over in Europe, and that eventually jumped across the pond. I've always wanted to use that term my whole life, and now I finally got to, so I feel great about it. And so it finally came in and said, hey, we see that you're missing, for lack of a better word, the third corner of this triangle. And a lot of people caught on to turbo and said, hey, this is actually a really good viable strategy too. So mid-range and control was all that was left after Flash pushed all other aggro out. But when Flash got banned, there was just two parts of the triangle and nothing was filling it. So mid-range flooded in, and eventually turbo came in and kind of rightfully put its place in. And that's so cool to kind of see where we can find those corollaries in CEDH versus the 60 card format.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love the fact that you brought up specifically how much space Flash was taking in the format, just because that happens all the time too. And in 60 card formats as well, you have certain decks or certain strategies that come out of nowhere and really kind of destroy the rock, paper, scissors thing as we know it, because it's like so much of the format revolves around this strategy that it's hard to even be like, okay, cool, well, it's just this general archetype of decks, because everybody is so focused on this one strategy. I think the one ideal example I would say that I can remember is like Hogak. When Hogak was around in Modern, so much of the format revolved around that deck that it was really hard to think of and of course Hogak was like part combo, and then also it had the aggro thing, but it was also mid-range because it could do so many things. So it was hard to really define it. So a lot of the space for this theory was really taken up by the fact that you had such a dominant thing. And that happens from time to time just due to card design, I think, in Magic. So I'm really glad that you brought that up because, yeah, that's something that does happen a lot.
That's awesome. Okay, so now we kind of have an idea of what the specific archetypes are and their translated counterparts in CEDH. So let's actually get into the window theory parts itself. What are each of these archetypes' specific window?
Right. So when we're talking about their window, and when we keep saying window, but the visualization that we want you guys to picture in your head is if every player in the pod has a space. And when we're saying go for the win, imagine that they are physically going for it. They are moving through a window. That window will grow or shrink depending on the actions and the timing and the state of the game. So if you're picturing an actual window, the idea is that each of these decks has a specific time in the game where their window will be wide open. For Turbo, that is going to look like an exponential downshift. So if we're talking about a graph, it's something that starts off really high and then as the game progresses goes very low. The window is going to be wide open from turn 0, and then it will never be as open as that. And so turbo decks, in order to play with that window, are utilizing fast rituals, fast mana, things of that nature, really fast combos to get through that window as fast as possible before it closes on you. The biggest example that we have right now in the format is Roxai. A lot of people quote it as the fastest deck in the format. I agree. And that cannot be truer than in Roxai. Your window to win with Roxai is as open as when you start the game. And from there on, it doesn't close completely. Obviously, there are nuances to every situation, but from then on, from turn 0 on, that window is going to slow down the more your opponents are able to set up, get reactionary interaction, all things of these pieces that they are able to move and work with you. You want to go as fast as possible before that happens. So that's kind of Turbo's window.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. So I play Godo, Bandit Warlord. For those of you who don't know out there, it's a very uncommonly known fact. It's one of the secrets I keep close to my chest. But basically, Godo is, I would say, one of the quintessential turbo decks. For a long time, it was considered one of the fastest decks in the format until, like I said, the Turbo Grixis came over and it kind of got overtaken as not as fast as, Rogsai. And I would agree that, the turbo builds of Rogsai, not the mid-range builds of Rogsai, are, I would say, some of the fastest in the format. But seizing your window in that and saying that it's the biggest in the earliest parts of the games, I absolutely 100% agree with that. Because when I was playing at SCGCon Cincinnati, it was like a couple of weeks ago at the time of this recording, I got top 16. And really what I had to do every time I sat at the tables for the rounds of Swiss, I had to evaluate what my seat position was and how I can best capitalize on that before my window closed. And I never called it that before. I was like, okay, I think I probably in this pod composition in my seat, I probably have 3 turns before it's over. And that's kind of stuff that I would say. I'd be like, okay, I think I have maybe 3 turns. And I would mulligan a hand that says, okay, this does a turn 4. That's actually too late. Okay, this does a turn 2. That's my hand. I'm going to go for it. And I would be able to seize my wins because of the fact that I was trying to make sure that I leverage that window, even though I never called it that before. So I think this is so cool that to actually put these, like I said, these terms to it. I would do exactly what you said with my Godo deck. I would say, all right, I don't have many turns for this. And it was 100% true, by the way. I usually presented my wins and they got interrupted. And usually by turn 4, if turn 4 rolled around, I wasn't winning. And it happened every time. If turn 4 or 5 rolled around, I was done. And so it's very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing that I really like that you brought up was the idea between like Roxai having 2 different builds. There are the turbo lists that use the fast mana and are trying to play this game that turbo usually falls into of like going, above people's tempo. I'm just going to go faster than you and stop, there's not going to be a need for us to go into the mid-range because I'm trying to win before then. And this definitely does translate to 60 card because that's the whole idea. I think the biggest 60 card deck that I would say plays into that is like red deck wins.
Yeah, red deck wins. Yep.
Yeah. Literally the idea of red deck wins, if anybody knows the history of that deck, is I do have card advantage. I am utilizing card advantage. My card advantage is my opponent has 60 cards in their deck. They will lose out on card advantage if they cannot play them because they are dead. And that is kind of the same school of thought. And so the idea is that you can look at Roxai and you could be like, yeah, sure, I can take this to the mid-range if I want to, and I can build it that way. But I can put all of these cards here and really look at it and say, hey, actually, instead, I'm just going to tune this so that I don't even have to worry about tempo. We're going before that even becomes ideal. So that's really cool.
Yeah, so the turbo versions of Roxai sacrifice card quality for speed. They say I have a 0-drop creature in the command zone that I can sack to an Infernal Plunge or a Culling the Weak and get there faster than anybody else because that card in the command zone costs 0. And they'll sacrifice some of their card quality for that. And then some of the mid-range builds of it, or what I would like to consider more mid-range builders, they say things like, my first job above anything else is to get a card advantage engine executed, whether that be Rhystic Study or a Mystic Remora or, something to that effect. That's usually what they do first, and then they go for it after that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very interesting because when we're talking about 60 card, we're talking specifically about one opponent. But of course, in Commander, it's 3v1. And so you're looking at essentially the idea as a turbo pilot would be to look at all three of your opponents, see how fast they are trying to play the game, and then whatever pace they are setting, you're faster than that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is turbo. So we have two more. So we have mid-range, and then we would have what we consider control. So talk to us about, I guess, the antithesis of aggro is control, right?
Right.
Or is it? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So control and stacks, I've grouped them together in this kind of theory just because when it comes to Commander, they play very similar. And that is the idea that when we're looking at that same window that we were doing for Turbo, Control sees that window and then says, this window can only get bigger the longer this game goes. And the difference between stacks and control in that sense, we'll talk about later. There's some nuances, but the idea is that as long as I can progress the game to a state where my card value goes higher, then my window will exponentially grow. And so the graph, if we're talking about the graph where Turbo is, this exponential downshift, stacks and control is an exponential upshift, meaning that it's the lowest that it's going to be on turn 0. But the more that you go and the more that you invest in the turns and keep this game going, congrats, your window is going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And so that goes in with the game plan that we see stacks and control decks do anyways in the format, right? Is the idea that I'm going to play these pieces to shut out my opponents, to stop them from moving and trying to grow their window. And I'm going to then just play value and grind this game to dust until I can get to a point where this window can be wide open and I can just walk through it. I don't even have to do, a lot to even get this win. And so the difference between stacks and control in that matter, despite the fact that I would count them as the same school, is that control is very outward facing, whereas stacks is very inner facing. I think stacks wants to look at their window specifically and say, I want this to be as wide open as possible. Whereas control is very outward facing and is like, my window is going to grow as long as this game goes. I need to make sure my opponents stay low. Their window is going to stay as small as humanly possible. But the idea is the same, that as this game progresses, my chances of winning will only go up. So that's stacks in a nutshell, I would say.
Yeah, that's interesting. On the most recent episode of Masterpieces, I played Atraxa Grand Unifier, and basically I played it like Control. I played Table Police in that episode. Card somewhere, show notes, something like that. Check out the episode. You might like it. Anyway, so basically really what it boiled down to was somebody went for a win, I stopped it. Somebody went for a win, I stopped it. Oh, a huge advantage was about to be swung in somebody's favor, I stopped it. And it wasn't until like turn 5 or 6 maybe, that I was like, okay, now I can start to shift into really making sure that things are going to start to close out. And so I cast my commander at one point and got a whole bunch of cards, and Atrax was really good about that because I was draining my hand with all the control that I was doing, and I had to battle these different players to play that control game. And that's exactly what ended up happening. We had Selvala across the table. I had Anala across the table, and they were trying to win very quickly, and I had to keep stopping them. And then when I got into the late game, I was able to say, okay, now it's time for me to finally close this out. And then I, tune into the episode to find out what the results were. So, but yeah, it's, and like I said earlier, I play Turbo a lot, but I had to play a completely different game, a completely different mulligan game, a completely different threat assessment, and, understanding what people were doing. It was a whole different way and approach to play the game entirely. I was a completely different person, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is a completely different game. Whereas I would attribute Turbo to being sort of this race in that my opponents, what they have in their deck and the interaction that they have won't matter as long as I'm faster than the point in which they can set up to get there. Stacks is more so, I am going to see their interaction. I know that I'm going to see it. I'm going to make it. We're going to grind it into dust. It's a war of attrition, I think, with Stacks and Control. You're not racing them. You are going to see what they have and make sure that it is a non-factor. And in that sense, it's a completely different ball game, because now, whereas I'm not racing against the clock, I'm really battling them on the stack and their decks and on the board in terms of presence. Their board state and board presence becomes so much more relevant on average than other Turbo decks, which is really cool.
Absolutely. All right, so then the final one, which is Midrange. So tell us about Midrange.
So Midrange is the weirdest one, right? Because Stacks and Turbo are kind of doing this mirror dance where, you have this exponential downshift for Turbo, and then you have this upshift for Stacks. Midrange says, you know what? I'm just going to take the game as it comes. Their graph is going to look varied. And the reason why is because mid-range piles are made to be varied. Like I said before, mid-range really just translates to a pile of cards that are able to do a lot in a given format. That's literally what the Rock, which is a lot of times attributed as being sort of the original mid-range deck, being this like Golgari pile in modern. The idea was just to be able to have a bunch of good cards that can just do whatever I need in terms of the meta. And so mid-range is very varied in that sense, where their graph is just going to be all over the place. Sometimes their window is going to be wide open. Sometimes they can go for the combo win and go out. Sometimes it's going to be very small. The idea is no matter how wide or low their window is, they're going to be able to have a way. It will never 100% be fully closed, but it also, to that point, will also never be 100% wide open, if that makes sense. It's the idea is that there will always be a way. If I had to do the best way to explain it, it would be, if anybody in here or is listening plays fighting games, then the idea would be, as I know you do as well, I would say Turbo is like a rushdown character. You're trying to go as fast as possible, hit them with as many combos before they're able to set up their own game plan. Stacks is going to be your more zoners. You want to keep away and make sure and control your opponent and make sure that they're out on their own. I would say mid-range is your Ryus, your all-arounders. They don't necessarily excel at anything specifically, but they also don't suck at anything. And sometimes that's enough, is the ability to just be decent at everything. You have the removal, you have the combos, you have the card advantage, you have, the stacks pieces to just have a little bit of everything. Sometimes it's good enough because, as we know, this is 3v1. Sitting down at a table with 3 other decks that you have no idea, sometimes it's good to just be prepared for whatever. And sometimes in other decks with Turbo or Stacks, you don't necessarily have that. If an opponent sits down and is just way faster than you and you don't have the pieces to keep tempo, sometimes that means that your window is just going to shut and it sucks. You won't have an opportunity to build with them. Mid-range is all about being able to grow and go with the pod. And so as such, their graph is going to look up and down and everywhere around. But it will never that is the idea, that it will never be 100% closed and it will also never be 100% open is kind of the trade-off.
Interesting. I think we all kind of consider the quintessential mid-range deck in our format to be Blue Farm, Timnacrom. And I think it's really interesting that you say that there's these windows and stuff like that that open and close with mid-range. And I think that helps answer a lot of questions why Timnacrom can top 16 so much, but has a really difficult time in closing it out. Because it's real easy for anybody to pick up Timna and Crom and just kind of steal some wins here and there because you can just find your zone without really knowing that. What I find a lot of times is that a lot of people played Timnacrom as a turbo deck by accident. Well, it has ad nauseum, so obviously this is a turbo deck, and they seized the wrong window and got stopped. And as people started playing this and as people started to talk about this deck more and more, they're realizing they're like, hey, this actually isn't a turbo deck. This is a mid-range deck. And there are some schools of thought that are even kind of maybe sending it into the control space, which is really cool, but that's a subject for another day. But like the idea that it can say, all right, I've gained some advantage. I was able to slow down the turbo deck. I was able to make sure that I've kind of kept the control deck on the back foot here. It hasn't been able to take over the game yet. And I'm going to use something like a silenced effect to seize this window. And it just does that mid-range so well. Like you said, it finds these windows really, really well because of how it's built.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say kind of like to your point, Blue Farm has a really good job of doing what I think mid-range just does a really good job at, and that's pivoting. That's the reason why its windows are able to open and close so well, is because if one game plan gets shut out, if we're talking about the other schools of thought, the other archetypes in terms of turbo and stacks, sometimes that's it. That's the end of the game. I've seen so many times someone's playing Tayam and they lose access to their graveyard and they're just like, okay, that's it. That's all I've got. Or, other times someone is playing Roxai and, the other two opponents after you have fishes and they stop your first attempt and you're like, well, that's it. That's all I've got. Blue Farm doesn't. Yep. It has a really good job of pivoting, and as such with most mid-range piles. The idea that somebody can play a Dothy Voidwalker and you tutored for things that had the Underworld Breach, but it doesn't matter because you have your commanders that are able to draw you cards and you can pivot into another situation. It's very tricky in that way to play because a lot of times it takes being able to read the board a lot more than just being able to be like, this is my game plan and I have to execute it. It requires a lot more finesse in that sense, I would say, but it also does have the idea that it can finesse its way out versus you just being screwed.
Would you say that mid-range has more windows than the others, or their windows are just in different places?
I would say that their windows, not necessarily that there are more windows, I would say that it is just varied. I would say everybody has one window, and the changes that we see with mid-range are all over the place. Turn 2 could be a great turn, and you're ahead of the curve, and look, you're ready to win, and then somebody does something, and now you're all of a sudden on the back foot, and that happens a lot. But the idea is that you can rebuild, and I think that makes your window, I guess the term I'm looking for is more flexible, whereas something can happen with you on turbo, and because you spent so many resources trying to beat people on the play and on this tempo, it is a lot harder for you to open that window back up. And so I would say the greatest way of like explaining it would be if you put all of your attributes into speed in a video game. Yeah, you're really good at doing that thing, but can you pivot to these other things? Mid-range is just making sure that you're putting all of those attributes across the board. You're not really going to excel at everything, but you are going to be able to do a little bit of everything. And sometimes that's enough. So
that's very cool. All right. So we have the idea of what each of these are and where their windows are, where they lie and stuff like that. So let's teach the people out there, myself included, like, how do we look for these windows? How do we seize these windows? And in which archetypes do we find these windows? So let's start off with Turbo. So how do we, learn how to locate and seize each of the windows, our windows in a Turbo deck?
Yeah. So Turbo, like we said, their window is going to be wide open from turn 0. From the moment that we are saying we're going to play Magic, that is your time to win. Now, ideally, if everybody could just get turn 0 wins, that would be great. But we can't. You do have to spend a little bit of mana and actually do a little bit of magicking to play Magic. Who would have thought? And so the idea, crazy. But the idea in order to seize your window in Turbo is you want to be the fastest. You want to look at all of your opponents from the moment before you even decide, you're resolving mulligans. You want to look at all of your opponents, see their game plans, and this obviously takes meta knowledge. But you want to look and see, okay, this deck is probably going to want to control the game and is going to want to go the distance. So I know I can be faster than them. This is a deck that's probably going to be more varied and is going to, go and come as the game pleases. So I need to watch out for the interaction with them. And then this is another turbo deck. So I know that they're going to be on the tempo with me. So maybe I need to be slower than them to allow some of that interaction to be used up. The idea is that you really want to look at the table and mulligan very aggressively to make sure that you have a line. And that I think that's one of the most important things with Turbo specifically is that I haven't played a Turbo deck yet that just wants okay hands. You want gas hands all the time. And it's so important specifically because of what we were talking about, where their window is less flexible than a mid-range pile, where you don't necessarily have the tools a lot of times to rebuild because you are sacrificing some of that card quality for speed. And as such, you need to be able to make sure that whatever you're going for has a plan. Okay, if I'm keeping this hand, I need to have a tutor. I need to have a way to get to whatever combo that is. If that is Thassa's Oracle, you need to have a way to get to Thassa's Oracle and the consultation or to empty your library. If that's Breach, you need a way to get to that intuition line or however. And so being mindful of your mulligans and really understanding how to get to those combos is key in Turbo, no matter what. I haven't seen a deck yet that's just like, oh yeah, this is seven lands, that's fine. Or, 6 lands and
lands and spells, let's play.
Let's go. Yeah, you don't want to do that with Turbo. You also want to make sure that you're utilizing your rituals and your tutors. The big thing with Turbo is that they want to hit mana thresholds. You need mana to play anything, specifically in Magic. And so with that, Turbo wants to hit a mana threshold where they have all of the mana possible to do everything very quickly. And so utilizing cards like Dark Ritual, like Cabal Ritual, like Seething Song, like Jessica's Will is a ritual even, to kind of chain together in Storm-like manner in order to hit that threshold as fast as possible is really great. Mana Crypts, Rocks, all of those things are all a part of that as well. Because by the time that you're on, that's all in speed, right? If you're on turn 3 and I have 7 mana and my opponents have only been hitting land drop dork or whatever, I'm ahead. I'm above the tempo of the game, which puts me in a position that my combo is likely to work because I have more resources, more mana to go off of. So that's also something that you want to do. And you want to be very mindful of removing problematic card engines and stacks pieces from your opponents. If we're talking about the triangle, remember, control stacks beats mid-range, and mid-range beats turbo. So mid-range is going to have the answers for whatever you're doing. They mulligan for it. We'll talk about it later, but that's one of the big things of mid-range. You want a varied hand that can not only build your game plan, but also stop your opponents. So don't ever have your combo and think, oh, this is just going to go off without a hitch. It probably won't. They probably do have the mind break trap. So you want to be prepared to play around that and really be able to fight on the stack. That's usually where Turbo likes to live, is on the stack, because you are chaining so many spells. That's where you're going to have to fight. Luckily, some decks can utilize silence effects. That's more on the mid-range and control side. You're just going to have to be able to protect it as well as possible. And yeah, be ready to pivot to game plans if they're stopped. You're not the best at doing this, but you can. There are times where you do have the extra tutor and you're like, well, that didn't work. Time to rebuild. Let me go get a card advantage and let me go get that fish. Let me go get One Ring and start rebuilding. So that's how I would say Turbo would seize their window.
That's very interesting because, and I'll translate the same thing over again with Godot. Basically, the biggest level up moment I have found with Turbo is learning how to mulligan better. And I know that that's an easy sentence to say, but a really hard plan to execute. Everyone tries to study the lines and stuff like that. And the lines are fine, good, great, get them under control, do some goldfishes. But after that, learn to mulligan, because the Turbo player that mulligans better is going to outperform those who just say, like you said, well, I've got this card and I really like it. Maybe I'll get there. Throw that hand away every time and make sure that you're getting a hand that allows you to embrace what your deck was built to do to begin with. So being the fastest deck at the table means being able to mulligan to be the fastest deck at the table. When I learned how to mulligan properly in Godot, my win rate shot up exponentially without changing a single card. A lot of people pontificate about deck building and card choices and that kind of stuff. That means nothing. This little card or that little card, swapped in or out is not the difference between your deck being number 1 and the deck being in just, number 30 out of 128. It is your mulligan choices that is going to level you up. And it's nowhere more prevalent, in my opinion, than Turbo.
Absolutely.
When you say utilizing rituals and tutors and stuff like that, that is 100% what I see in things like Godot builds. I'm trying to get this critical mass of mana and resources to be able to do what I'm doing versus I'm going to build, and then I'm going to build. And then, maybe I'll get there like a mid-range or a stacks deck might do. But Turbo is just like, I want to do as much as possible, as fast as possible before anybody can stop me from doing it. And I've found that is very much the case, because I've even seen in things like Kirk Clan Ironworks or Metal Worker. Those are a pseudo kind of what you're saying in those ritual effects. They can generate huge bursts of mana very, very quickly that allows me to springboard ahead, whereas those might not shine in other decks nearly as well, but they really find a really good home in Turbo decks. And then finally, what you said, like be ready, prepared to pivot. Turbo decks have a lot harder time doing that. And I know that we, in the Godot builds that we see and that I have, they have some things to be able to recover, but we don't have tons of things to recover. We don't have a plan C and a plan D and a plan E, and I can pivot this and steal that and do these other things. No, I cast Godot and I try to win. And if I don't do it, I cast Godot and try to win again. And that's what I got to do, or I got to get this certain thing back out of my graveyard. And it's like, there's a lot that goes into it. And being able to do that in a Turbo strategy to seize that window, I find that is all super interesting stuff, because like as a seasoned Turbo pilot, that is absolutely what I see when I play the game.
Yeah, 100%. Mulligans, that's the biggest thing I want. I would say I want Turbo players to get out of this, specifically on seizing your window, is mulligans are so important for Turbo specifically. Because like we said, if we're talking about how it is in terms of archetypes, you're based off an archetype where card quality is being sacrificed. So it doesn't matter if you draw more cards, right? Because in terms of theory, those cards are not as good as the other cards on the table. So you need cards that are going to be able to string along and get you where you need to be. So many times with my play groups and people who have taught how to play the game and things like that, I have been playing Turbo and mulligan down to 4 or even 3 sometimes. And they're looking like, what are you doing? No, stop. Don't you want more cards? And I'm like, the amount of times where it's like this mediocre 5 is not going to get me there, but this good 4 is. And it's all about having a plan. So that's the biggest thing, is really know how to mulligan, know how to plan, and get there. So yeah, I agree 100%. Mulliganing will get you up. Yeah.
Yep. So let's talk about stacks and control. So how do people learn in the stacks and control archetypes to when to find their windows, and how to identify them and how to seize them?
So stacks and control, in my eyes, not just in Magic, but in any card game. Any card game, their stacks and control has some form in. The number one thing I would say, if Turbo's number one thing is being able to mulligan properly and craft those hands, stacks would be to have the knowledge, learn the meta, take in the information. And the reason why is because not all stacks pieces are created equally. And you need to know, especially in a multiplayer format where it's 3v1 and it's not just 1v1, you have to know which ones are effective against your opponents and which ones are not. Because, yeah, sure, Grafdigger's Cage is really good against, this graveyard-centric deck that player 2's on, but player 3 and 4 don't care about their graveyard at all and are just going to let that slide. And now you have essentially shut out one opponent that could help you fight off these two. And that happens a lot with people who are new to stacks. And that's because they didn't necessarily take in the information on the deck or learn the meta. A lot of stacks and control is all about planning ahead, not just in the pregame, but before we even decide we're playing Magic at home, when you're watching our videos, or like going through and seeing things. That's where stacks lives, is really learning the list. Okay, cool. Blue Farm's really good right now. What's good against Blue Farm? Maybe I should play a Grafdigger's Cage. Maybe I should, go through and think about like Artifact Hate or things like that. Oh, Kinnon's really good right now. Maybe let me put in a Tashana's Timebender, or maybe not that one. I don't like that one.
Not that one.
maybe
Tashana's Timebender. God.
I've been playing so much Modern that in that sense, it is a good card. But like, I would not say do that in CDH. Do Cursed Totem. Everybody loves Cursed Totem. Yay! So yeah, do the homework, and that sucks because nobody likes doing the homework. But if you want to be really good, specifically with stacks and control, it's all about planning ahead and being a step ahead on your opponents in terms of board presence and everything else. And so learning what pieces you have in your deck to fight what certain strategies will allow you to know when to get them, when are they going to be effective, and when are they not. I've seen so many stacks players lose on the board just because they they played the wrong piece, where somebody needs, their graveyard and you're like, yeah, I'm going to stop that. Or somebody needs to search through their library to get certain answers and you put an Aven Mind Sensor out. But this person can trigger their commander throughout it at all. And you just stopped everybody from doing that. You have to play police, but play it well. It's a balancing act, right? You're playing a 3v1 format and you're actively trying to stop all three players at the same time. That is hard. That's not an easy task. That's, way harder than just being able to say, this is combo, let me go. So yeah. The best stacks decks that I see that are able to perform and do well, they're able to use their stacks pieces to pit other opponents against each other. If it doesn't have to be 3v1. It is 3v1 from the moment you start, but it doesn't have to stay that way. If you can politic and really use your voice to be like, hey, I know you don't like being shut off by this rule of law. However, Roxai has not been able to do a darn thing this entire game. Work with the other players. If you're able to do that and really present that, you can do well with stacks. And it really is just a lot of the homework, a lot of the politicking, a lot on the pilot. And that really is a hard jump to get through for a lot of newer players in the format, specifically with CDH and EDH as well. Players who are playing on a casual level with more control-y things. It's really hard to even think about like politicking, but it is something that you do need to do in order to be successful with stacks pieces, I believe, because you need to, not everybody has proper threat assessment. You need to let them know what it is. Sometimes you have to be the person to be like, no, that is not the threat. I'm all for playing spells. I understand some people are at school. No, don't talk, whatever. But sometimes people make bad decisions, and you need to make sure that they make not enough bad decisions that you are all losing the game, but enough that you're winning. And that's really hard to do. But that's kind of how you seize the win properly.
That's interesting. One of the things that I always tell budding stacks pilots to do is to go watch our previous episodes, and not just any episode, because you should be because they're great. I'm just saying, but honestly, you should be looking specifically for episodes with Charles in them. Charles, also known as the Mono White Guy on social media, is a prolific stacks pilot. He could take a Mono White deck, which would be for the longest time considered to be the weakest color pairing build, whatever you want to call it, in Commander, not CEDH, Commander. And he could take that to a top 4. And the reason is because he employs all of those things that you talked about, balancing acts and learning the meta. Like, he can anticipate your plays based upon what you flipped and the first land you've played that turn. That's how deep his knowledge goes, but that's also how deep his knowledge is required to play stacks well. I think one of the most important things that is a level up moment for stacks players is sequencing. Like, we said that turbo is, you want to level up quickly and learn how to get these windows, learn to mulligan better. For stacks players, it's learning to sequence better. Oh, here's my 1-drop into my 2-drop into my 3-drop. That's just counting. It's about sequencing that's important. You're like, I've got this Grafdigger's Cage, so I'm going to be land Grafdigger's Cage. Well, there's no cannon on the battlefield that's going to suddenly get to 7 mana. That's the Grafdigger's Cage is going to stop. And so what ends up happening is you'll see the sequencing that people like Charles will do will almost seem out of order. But as you see the makeup of the table and the texture of the table, you'll see that his sequencing is so on point because he says, I don't need to drop a turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage. It's not important. However, I've got Kinnan on the board, and they're 1 untap away from activating Kinnan every turn. Guess what? I'm going to drop this Grafdigger's Cage, and now they're going to have to spend a resource to stop it, and now they still won't have enough in order to be able to activate their Kinnan. So just by doing that, you have just thrown their tempo off so much by simply just resequencing how you play your stacks pieces. Compounding on what you said about having the right stacks pieces for the right meta. I mean, stacks is an archetype of silver bullets, but we have so many different decks and stuff like that. You have to choose where your silver bullets are. Mulligans obviously come into play once again, just like Turbo, but it's about sequencing those different pieces and knowing what you should keep and knowing what you should throw away in order to be able to effectively control the table like you need to do. You'll see so many new stacks players just saying, turn 1 Grafdigger's Cage into turn 2 Torpor Orb into turn 3 Aven Mind Sensor into turn 4 I lost and I don't know why. It's like, be like, well, it's because you thought you had to use your Aven Mind Sensor, even though no one was tutoring, so you didn't disrupt anyone's plays. You dropped your Grafdigger's Cage just because you played a land. You thought you needed to get it out of your hand, quote unquote. It's like, play it when it's right to play it. Don't just play it because you have it. And learning that is a huge level up moment for stacks players. Getting that sequencing correct will allow you to be able to get to that late game. And that's why so many beginner people that try out stacks says, oh, stacks isn't viable. It's not good in this format. Don't play stacks. It's not good. Don't even bother. It's because they're not doing it right, quite frankly. Not to be mean. It's just everyone, needs to learn a little bit more about it in order to really get efficient at it.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. I think the most terrifying games that I've played have been against really good stacks players who knew how to sequence. And it seemed, from my point of view as a turbo player or as a mid-range player, it seemed as though any time that I was trying to advance, it was almost like they were cheating. They like, oh, you have the Grafdigger's Cage now? How? Like how are you able to read? What are you talking about? How did you know? And it's all because they're paying attention. They know what my deck does before we even sit down, and they know what lines I'm going into because I'm playing. And so being able to sequence well, it's terrifying because at that point, especially as we were talking about before, with it being able to beat mid-range in this whole triangle section, limiting my options when I go for those options sucks. I just spent all that mana, like you said with Kenneth. What are you talking about? That sucks bad. And it's way worse than if you telegraph that turn 1. I know I have all the time in the world to get rid of that Grafdigger's Cage. Okay, cool. Yeah. You turn 1. All right, sweet. Draw. Oh, there it is. Cool. Goodbye. And it it's really easy. So to do that, so you want to make it as hard as possible. And when a Stacks player is playing right, those are the games where I'm like, okay, well, there's a little bit of salt here. I need to go away. I'm a little bit tempted.
There's nothing more salt-inducing than a Stacks player.
Than a good Stacks player. A bad
Yes,
Stacks player,
yes.
You know, it just took me a little bit longer to win. All right, cool. It's a 2-hour game instead of a 30-minute game. That's fine.
Yeah, thanks for wasting everyone's time. Appreciate you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A good one? Oh, man. Terrifying.
Yeah, and not to mention, you'll find a good Stacks player when you're sitting across from a Stacks player, and then just out of nowhere, you kind of look up, and then all of a sudden something just hits you right in the head. You're like, we're losing this game. What's going on here? And all of a sudden, it's all just shifted, and you had no idea why. And that's how you could tell a really good Stacks player. You're like, what just happened? Oh my God, we're losing right now. Like they've got you under this lock and key that you just have no way out of, and you don't know what in the world happened.
It's usually way too late. Yeah.
And it's too late. That's exactly right. It's way too late at that point. And that's how you could tell a good Stacks player right there.
Absolutely. God, now you make me want to play Stacks, but I'm not a good Stacks player, so I will leave that to them.
I kind of want to play it too, quite frankly. Yeah. Okay, so we have one more, and that is Midrange. So tell us about Midrange, finding the window, how to learn how to seize them, et cetera, et cetera.
So Midrange, like we said, it's the most varied when it comes to their window. Their window can be open, it can close, and open, close, and open, close. It can go back and forth, back and forth. The idea for a mid-range player when they sit down is to play to the table. You are usually the deck that is going to have the most answers, and it's going to have the access to the most answers at any given time. Just because the way that mid-range is in our meta right now, it's very heavily situated on card draw, which means you are going to usually see the most cards out of the decks here at the table. So you are... Quite frankly, you're the superhero at the table. You have to be the one to stop the Stacks player when they're going off. You're going to have to be the one to stop the turbo, usually. So it'll fall on you and the other mid-range decks at the table to kind of answer threats, including each other, just because you are the most equipped to do so. And with that, with great power comes great responsibility. You have to mulligan early. For interaction and card value engines above all else. You don't necessarily have to go for a win. You just have to make sure that you're mulliganing so you don't lose. That is, I think, the big difference between the mulligans that we put here for mid-range versus turbo. Turbo, a lot of times, is mulliganing for a win. I'm trying to mulligan so I can win here. And I know exactly how to do it step by step. Midrange doesn't necessarily have to do that, but they do have to look for counterspells, for interaction, for creatures that are or Stacks pieces, so to speak, that are able to allow them to be able to put advantage on the table and start seeing those options. Because as we know, more cards just equals more options. Your card quality, just the way that midrange is going to be better than any non-mid-range deck because a lot of the things that you're putting are not situational. They are varied for all things, which means that the cards have to be good. Otherwise, in a lot of situations, you can't just, play an Aven Mind Sensor out of nowhere because that Aven Mind Sensor may not be good for what you're trying to do versus, Culling Ritual or whatever, what have you, has a lot of uses. It's removal, but it also is a ritual. It gets you a lot of mana really fast. And those are kind of the card choices that you make when you're making your deck. So you should prioritize having more cards available than your opponents to make the decisions necessary to pilot your deck to its strengths. Your deck is good. Trust that. The idea is that you have to see the cards in order for it to be good. And if you do that, a lot of times the deck, you'll see a lot of decisions that are going to be made on your part. And a lot of the part on the pilot is to know your role. So if your deck is meant to draw cards and to see these options, then your role as the pilot is to know exactly where you are in the game. I think if Stacks is all about having that outside meta knowledge, And turbo is all about having sort of that inner knowledge, that inner deck knowledge of knowing the lines and how to mulligan and how to get there. I would say mid-range, more importantly than the others, is having the board sense, if that makes sense. And by that I mean board sense is the ability to look at where everybody's at the table. That person's winning. Okay, cool. That's your job to know that. If that person's going for a win or just tutored twice, maybe it's good to point that out to the table. That's good for anybody to point out, but you have to know that specifically because that relates to your window, because you can usually never outpace turbo decks. So you don't want to waste your resources trying to do so. And so you can sit back and stop their win attempts if you're playing against them, and then try then, because you'll know that that's when your window will grow bigger, just because you're not going to be faster than them. But same with stacks. You'll never really be able to out-control them, so then don't. Beat them to the punch and present wins before they can do that to you. Mid-range is this constant dance, both in 60 card and EDH, and it requires incredible board knowledge from the pilot. So you just always have to be alert into what role you're playing in the pod specifically, and know when you need to change jerseys and change roles before it's too late. Because I see that's the biggest thing for mid-range for me is a lot of people will be like, oh, I'm just going to sit and draw cards, and don't know when it's time to pivot. When, okay, you've drawn enough cards, that turbo deck is about to go for their win next turn. You need to do something immediately. You need to start using those cards. Or that stacks decks is about to turn the corner. You need to do something about it. This is your time to go. So mid-range, in order to seize your window, really knowing that dance of when to kind of switch, when to use your cards and why, is the biggest thing.
One of the things that was a huge level up moment for me when I was talking about mid-range and learning mid-range, because I was a turbo pilot forever and I just couldn't make it work. I didn't like it. I didn't really enjoy how mid-range played, and I lost a lot of games because of it. And it was, I forget exactly who it was, but essentially what it was they said to me, if you want to be a good mid-range pilot, you need to embrace discomfort. And I was like, what does that mean? They said, basically, you need to just embrace the idea of being uncomfortable with the positions that you're frequently at a table, or the decisions that you're making, or being unsettled in certain things until you get used to mid-range. And what they basically meant was, hey, as a turbo pilot, you need to mulligan and see the win. You need to see the end of the game where it says, I win the game in your opening hand. Mid-range, you can't do that. You can't say, well, there's the end right there in these 7 cards, and so you'll throw them away. What you see instead is you say, okay, here's a way to get to an advantage engine. Then I have to go into the mid-game and then see what I can do from there. Or I have to stop the turbo, then see what I can do from there. And you don't get to see the entire path before you. You only get to see about 3 or 4 steps before you. And then after you get to those 3 or 4 steps, you have to see what the next 3 or 4 steps are. And then every single time that you do that, if you're not used to playing these mid-range decks, you get uncomfortable. And they say, embrace that discomfort, trust in the power of your cards and your deck and your abilities, and you'll be able to embrace this mid-range plan very well. I know it was a big level up moment for me in the mulligan space when I was like, okay, I don't see an obvious path to victory here, but what I do see is a path. I see one piece of interaction to stop turbo, and then a ability to get a Rhystic Study on turn 2. And basically, I only had 2 turns planned out. And I had no idea what I was going to do from that point forward. But it was the idea of having at least settling into that discomfort and saying, okay, this is what I have to do. And then, like you said, try to feel out where these windows will present themselves, because you are just wading neck deep in the water when you're in mid-range, trying to find out where these different windows are going to open up, and you don't always know which direction is forward. And like I said, that could be very uncomfortable for a turbo player, and it might be a little bit more comfortable for a stacks player, but usually they're always wanting to react to everything, and you can't always do that in mid-range either. So the knowing your role part, I think, is a really, really critical part of this. I think it's a really good, insightful thing to know. I'm not going to be able to play turbo, So I need to stop thinking turbo. I'm not going to play control. So I know that I can't stop everything. So it can't just be interaction and nothing else. I need to find like interaction and an advantage engine or interaction in my next step. And having that knowledge of knowing what your role is, I think is a really critical piece of really finding these windows. So I think it's really insightful to say that know your role part.
Absolutely. And I love that you said mid-range a lot is like sitting in that discomfort. Specifically because recently I've been trying to get back into grinding and tournament grinding. I did a lot of that for 60 card and doing RCQs. Now I've been doing that for EDH. And one person who has been really helpful in that with me, shout out to I think one of the greatest players in our format currently is Max Sternberg, Wounded Satellite. He is amazing cannon pilot. And an amazing host as well. Shout out to Colors Are a Crutch. It was really great. But one thing that he said in our coaching sessions was, wait it out. Be okay with just being comfortable and grinding the game out. Your deck is good. Trust that. See the cards and go with it. And there were so many times, because as myself, I started out as a turbo player and went up. There were so many times where we were going through test hands and I'm looking and I'm like, he's like, okay, what do you want to do? I'm like, oh, I have this Fabricate. I can go for a turn 2 win attempt with Assault and go for it. He's like, okay, cool. Now what happens if you get stopped? I was like, I don't know. Then we lose, I guess.
I guess we lose. Yeah. Duh. I'm a turbo player. I lose.
I lose. Yeah, we're done. And there were so many times where he was like, okay, well, what if you prioritize getting Kinnan out, getting that mana advantage, maybe spinning a little bit and just grinding? And then he was like, you still have Fabricate in hand. And look, you waited 2 extra turns and we would wait. And the next card would be like a force. And I would get like Nezahal on the board and stuff like that. And he's like, now look, you can go for the win now. And you have carded and you have interaction in hand to the buttload. You have this card draw engine where if opponents try to interact with you, you are able to still draw cards. You are so much more comfortable going for that win now because you were able to know your role and wait. And so I think about that all the time now, not just with Kinnan, but with any mid-range deck. Of being able to know, okay, is this the time to jam? No? Okay, cool. Then let's sit back. Let's really lean on these interactive tools that we put in our deck, because I don't just want to say card draw, because it could just be you're sitting around with the Orcish Bowmasters. Everybody else is drawing. You're really cleaning board. Maybe the board is what needs to be cleaned up. You're doing that. There's so many different mid-range pieces that you can use, especially now in our meta, and really trusting in those and being uncomfortable for a meantime and really waiting and letting that role play itself out and being the pilot that is able to see that allows you to be a lot more comfortable in the long run. So I love that idea of discomfort because that's generally what it is.
Yeah, embracing that discomfort. Just say, I want to jam this right now and go for it. And you're like, you're going to lose. Yeah, maybe you'll seize a win or two, but in the long run, you're always going to lose when you do that like that. You're not a win first deck. You're a win second deck. So wait till somebody else goes, they spin their interaction, and then you win. But that's uncomfortable because you're like, I know I have it, and I have to somehow not do it. I have to resist the impulse or the urge to do it, and it's uncomfortable to wait at times, especially as a turbo player. I have impulse control issues apparently, so it's so uncomfortable. I need to go.
Yeah, I'm the same way. The amount of times that I've been like, oh yeah, nowadays where they're like, oh wow, you had that Tezzeret? How did that happen? Oh, I've had that turn 1. I could have jammed that, but I decided not to, and now look, I still won. Yay! Now look. Awesome. So yeah, that's kind of all 3. I would say my advice in terms of like how to seize your windows when playing these different things. And I know one thing that comments are probably going to say, but what about combo decks? What about this deck in particular? There are decks that don't necessarily neatly fit into these 3 archetypes. That's the same with 60 card. But the idea is that every deck is going to play into one of these roles at some point in some fashion. Just because your super awesome brew doesn't necessarily fit turbo, but it's faster than a mid-range, but it can also control. That's great. It fits somewhere here on this spectrum. of this triangle, and so this is going to apply to just about every deck. That's just how Magic as a game was really designed, and it's really cool to see that.
Agreed.
Awesome. But yeah, I think we covered everything. So I hope that we were able to give you guys some really cool insight. Again, I want to shout out to Rebell Son for starting that conversation with me, and then as well as Ken Bauman for also kind of going through that conversation with me as well. There's a lot of really great minds in this meta, and I was just able to kind of build on the minds that have already been doing the work. So that's really great, and I hope we were able to help you guys out. But to the listeners, we always leave you guys with a question. And today's question, I want to know, what is your favorite deck archetype and why? Ryan, what's your answer for this?
I mean, it's Turbo. It's Turbo because I love the going first aspect. I love being the answer. The deck that you have to answer, the one that everyone else worries about. I love being able to overcome those obstacles.
Yeah, I would say I'm the same. I love playing Turbo. I play a lot more mid-range these days just because of like just the way that the meta is and me just trying to hone in on that aspect. But nothing like having a good 7 of just, oh, I can go turn 2 on this and just go in goblin mode. It's crazy. I love it so much. God, nothing like it. But yeah, awesome. Well, make sure to give us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast aggregator. You'd be surprised at how much it helps. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social medias. All of the links are in the episode notes around. And yeah, well, that about wraps it up for this podcast. Tune in next time when we talk more about our favorite format and our favorite game, Magic the Gathering. Thank you so much for watching and listening. We love your support. And we will see you next time. Take care, guys.